Matt Delvecchio here. We talk a lot about caregivers here on Life Unrehearsed. Almost 1 in 4 Canadians are caregivers, many of them unpaid and untrained. It's a tough job. Well, joining us now is Dr. Mike Lang, a Calgary-based health researcher, filmmaker, and adventure guide who's dedicated his career to supporting caregivers and patients through innovative storytelling and outdoor adventures. Dr. Lang is the creator of the award-winning series Caregivers in the Wild, which explores the experiences of family caregivers amidst the stunning landscapes of Western Canada. Dr. Lang, welcome to Life Unrehearsed.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Well, thank you for coming on. So let's hear a little bit more about your project called Caregivers in the Wild.
Yeah, it's part of a larger platform called Stories for Caregivers, and if you search storiesforcaregivers.com, you can watch. There's a bunch of different series on there meant to support family caregivers, and this was all started actually by the TELUS Fund, which is the not-for-profit arm of TELUS. They fund all sorts of Canadian content, but they sort of recognized, just like what you said, 1 in 4 Canadians. It's a huge population. And we don't do a whole lot of time focusing on resources that can support this demographic, which ultimately is sort of the linchpin of the healthcare system, right? If they can no longer do their job and the unpaid caregiving work that they do, our healthcare system would collapse. And so the entire idea is to sort of create content that would help people sort of get a clear understanding of what their caregiving is and think a bit more reflectively about it, but then also come up with some tips and tools that can help them improve their own, care for themselves in some ways while they're caring for others. And that's really what Caregivers in the Wild is all about. And it's really fun. We get people out away from their everyday caregiving routines into nature, and we do all sorts of fun adventure activities. And while we're out there, we sort of look at nature and the world around us and find different metaphors that we can use to sort of help relate and understand our caregiving experiences a little more clearly when you have some reflective distance from it. So that's what it's all about.
I love it. We've had many caregivers and professionals on the show, and I love your angle here, caregivers in the wild, getting out there. So what inspired you to begin this, and what have you learned from the experience?
Yeah, well, it first started, I used to run a charity called Survive and Thrive Cancer Programs, and we would take young adult cancer survivors on adventure trips, and we would encourage them to bring a caregiver with them. And that's because we didn't want them going back home without someone who sort of understands sort of the life-changing experience they were about to have outside. And then as we went on these trips, we sat around the campfires at night and had these conversations. I started to recognize, wait a second, family caregivers get just as much out of this experience as the people who they're caring for. And so maybe, these outdoor adventures are just as valuable for people on both sides of the sort of the healthcare equation. And so that's when I sort of came up with the idea and pitched that to TELUS. And of course, they've loved it. And some of the things I've learned over the years, that was the first one, right? I think sometimes we don't spend enough time focusing on the stories and experiences of family caregivers. That was something that I learned. But also, I've learned that there's lots of different ways family caregivers are involved beyond some of the physical acts of caregiving, right? I think there's a lot of other different elements that go into caregiving that sometimes we don't quite recognize or value in the same way that maybe we do as if someone is, putting an IV in or, cleaning a tracheostomy tube or, there's certain things that caregivers do for their loved ones that we sort of see as caregiving, but some of the other stuff we don't recognize as much. And I would say that's a lot of the psychosocial side of caregiving doesn't get as much recognition. And that's what's really interesting about Caregivers in the Wild is we delve into a lot of those other sides of caregiving that sometimes aren't as well recognized.
Listening to Life Unrehearsed, Matt Delvecchio here, and I'm talking to Dr. Mike Lang about caregiving and his film Caregivers in the Wild under some beautiful scenery, Dr. Lang, in Western Canada. Now let's focus in a little bit more on caregiving. And why do you think caregiving is such an important issue in Canada right now?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of hinted at it in the opening question, right? But without family caregivers, our healthcare system would collapse. It literally would collapse. And so, I think, people are starting to sort of recognize this. There's all sorts of different advocacy groups that are sort of popping up, but there's also different, charities out there trying to support family caregivers. And, you said you have lots of family caregivers on your show. And I'm sure through those conversations you recognize sort of the toll that can take on people. But also, I think family caregivers haven't often thought of themselves as a caregiver, and that's one of the really interesting things we found about the show. Is sometimes I'll hear about someone who is, for example, caring for her husband with the ALS, and I'll call them up and I'll say, hey, do you want to come on the show? And they're like, what do you mean caregiver? Why did you think I should be on the show? And I sort of have to describe to them what a caregiver is and why they fit the bill, right? And so sometimes people just say, I'm doing this because I love that person. They don't actually recognize or maybe we haven't put a label on some of the activities they're doing and how valuable they really are. And so I think that's part of it, is just raising awareness that this is a really difficult thing that people are taking on often. It's many, many unpaid hours and lots of logistics and very difficult situations that they're dealing with day in and day out, and we need to do a better job of supporting people through that, I think, as a society.
Absolutely. Just on that note, they are truly the unsung heroes here. And
yeah.
I think you're bringing up an important point that, they're in a caregiver role, whether they chose to be, probably not, and never formally educated on how to properly do caregiving. How can friends and families and the communities better support our caregivers?
Yeah, that's a great one. So I've had many, many conversations, hundreds of hours of conversations with family caregivers over the years in these different projects and adventures and stuff. And one of the things that is pretty consistent is, the best way to support a family caregiver is just to do things. Not to ask them what they need, but just to do things for them. And, a lot of times, if people, especially in acute caregiving situations, they're just in survival mode, they don't know what they need, right? They don't know how someone could help. And really, when they get all these requests, how can I help you? Many people don't even know how to respond because they can't even think about what they're doing in the next 30 minutes, right? And so I've heard that pretty consistently. We just need to do things for them, right? Whether that's picking their kid up from school that day, dropping off food without asking them what they need, just showing up and doing things, showing up and cleaning their house or mowing the lawn or whatever, I think that's one of the biggest ways that as a community we can help each other, is just show up for each other, right? And not even ask for things, but just do it.
Get it done. Love that. All right. Talking with Dr. Mike Lang about caregiving in his film Caregivers in the Wild. Quickly running out of time here, Dr. Lang. I'm going to put you on the spot here. If you had to give one piece of advice you'd give to someone who is currently a caregiver, what would that be?
Great one. Well, I would say spend some time reflecting on your caregiving experience, because I think what happens often is we just sort of get carried along by the demands of everyday life or demands of a caregiving situation, and we don't have to actually stop to think about, what are we doing? Why are we doing those things? Could we be doing those things differently? And what do we need to do to make sure we can continue to do those things? And that's what's really cool about Caregivers in the Wild, is we take people out into the wilderness, away from those caregiving activities for 3 days, and they start to think about, okay, what am I doing? How could I do it differently? And we start to explore these different topics. And not only do they head back into those caregiving situations refreshed, they have just a new perspective and a new value. They place a new value on what they're actually doing. And sometimes that's the most important part, to not just get constantly carried along in life, but to stop every once in a while and think about what's happening and how it potentially could be different.
Great advice. Thank you very much, Dr. Lang, for taking a little time and sharing your wisdom. It's very much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Now, you got to check out the Caregivers in the Wild film. Dr. Lang, if you're still there, how can we find out a little bit more about that Caregivers in the Wild? Is there a link?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, Caregivers in the Wild. You can just Google it. We're the only people that came up with that name before. So search Caregivers in the Wild. You can also go to storiesforcaregivers.com. And you can also check out Stories for Caregivers on Facebook. There's over 60,000 family caregivers on that Facebook page. And we share all of the stories on there. Lots of people have great conversations in the chat and support each other there. So go check out that community. And yeah, hopefully, share it with some friends and family who you may know who are caregivers who could sort of benefit from some tips and tools about how to do that in a better way for themselves and others.
Love it. And just like you're saying, just do it. Get it done. Forward it off to people you might like. All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Lang.